The people who laugh at you the loudest are usually the ones who never bothered to learn your name. I didn't know that sentence would change my life. At the time, I was just trying not to drop a tray of champagne glasses. The Grand Regency Hotel glittered like a palace made of gold and glass. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, scattering warm light across marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected every designer shoe that crossed them. The city's wealthiest people filled the ballroom. Politicians, CEOs, socialites, people who spent more on a single dinner than I spent on rent in a month. And then there was me, Emily Parker, 26 years old, part-time event waitress, full-time survivor. I adjusted the cuff of my black uniform and tightened my grip on the silver tray balanced against my shoulder. My feet already ached from 10 hours of standing. The cheap flats I'd bought on clearance 6 months ago weren't designed for luxury galas, but they were all I had. Table 12 needs a refill, my supervisor called. I nodded immediately. On it, the music from a live string quartet drifted through the ballroom while guests laughed over glasses of wine and expensive cocktails. Everything smelled like roses, polished wood, and money. The kind of money that solved problems before they existed. I moved carefully between tables, keeping my eyes down. People rarely looked directly at the staff anyway. Most treated us like furniture. Useful, invisible, replaceable. I had almost reached table 12 when I heard someone call out, "Excuse me." A woman wearing a silver designer gown waved me over. Diamonds sparkled around her neck. She couldn't have been older than 40, but she carried herself like royalty. "Yes, ma'am?" I asked. "Champagne." I immediately reached for the bottle on my tray. As I poured, another guest stepped closer to greet her. They exchanged air kisses and laughter. Then everything happened at once. The woman turned too quickly. Her elbow bumped her own glass. The champagne spilled across the front of her silver dress. The conversation around the table stopped. For one brief second, everyone stared at the stain. Then the woman's eyes locked onto me. "Are you serious?" she snapped. My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry. Look what you've done." I blinked. "Ma'am, I didn't touch. You ruined my dress." Several guests turned toward us. The woman stood abruptly. "Do you know how much this gown costs?" Heat rushed into my face. "I'm very sorry your dress was stained, but this is exactly why hotels hire the wrong people." Her voice carried across nearby tables now. More heads turned. More eyes watched. No training. No standards. A few people chuckled. I felt every laugh like a pebble striking glass. Small. Sharp. Humiliating. "Ma'am," I said quietly, "I truly don't believe I caused." "Of course you don't." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "People like you never take responsibility." More laughter followed. I stared at the floor. The marble beneath my shoes suddenly felt miles away. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat. Because hospital bills didn't care about pride. My mother's treatments didn't pause because my feelings were hurt. I needed this job. Around me, conversations resumed. Guests smiled into their drinks. The entertainment continued. For them, it was a momentary distraction. For me, it felt like standing under a spotlight. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt something else. Someone watching. Not the curious stares of wealthy strangers. Not the amused glances from people eager for gossip. Something different. Steady. Focused. Intentional. I lifted my eyes. Across the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a man stood alone. Tall. Dark suit. Hands folded calmly in front of him. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even speaking. He was simply watching. Watching me. And for the first time that night, I had the strange feeling that the worst moment of my life had just become the beginning of something far bigger. The rest of the gala passed in a blur of polished smiles and invisible wounds. I kept moving because stopping would have meant thinking, and thinking would have meant replaying every laugh in my head. My hands carried trays. My feet crossed marble floors. My mouth repeated the same polite phrases over and over. "Enjoy your evening. Can I get you anything else? Thank you for attending." But inside, I felt hollow. The woman in the silver gown never looked at me again. For her, the moment had already passed. For me, it lingered like a stain that would not wash away. Near midnight, the final guests began leaving. The ballroom slowly emptied. Chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but without the crowd, the room felt strangely cold. I collected abandoned glasses and folded linen napkins while the cleaning crew rolled carts across the floor. My supervisor approached holding a clipboard. The expression on his face told me everything before he spoke. "Emily, come with me." My stomach tightened. I followed him into a small office behind the ballroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He closed the door. "We received a complaint." I stared at him. "About tonight?" He nodded. "A very important guest was unhappy." I looked down at my hands. I did not spill the drink. "That is not really the issue." "Then what is?" He sighed heavily. "People noticed the scene. Management believes it reflected poorly on the event." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. I am being blamed because someone else embarrassed me? His eyes softened briefly before hardening again. "The hotel cannot afford problems with high-profile clients." A painful silence filled the room. Then he slid a paper across the desk. "Tonight will be your last shift." I felt the air leave my lungs. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, like a balloon losing pressure. "You are firing me." "I am sorry." I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain. I wanted someone, anyone, to admit how unfair it was. Instead, I thought about my mother lying in a hospital bed 3 miles away. I thought about next month's rent. I thought about the stack of unpaid bills sitting on my kitchen counter. None of those things cared whether life was fair. I signed the paper. 15 minutes later, I stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night, carrying a cardboard box with my uniform folded inside. The city glowed around me. Yellow taxi lights, storefront windows, traffic signals changing colors above crowded intersections. Everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere important. Meanwhile, I stood alone on the sidewalk wondering how I was supposed to tell my mother I had lost my job. A light rain had started falling. Tiny droplets gathered on my jacket. I pulled it tighter around myself and began walking toward the subway station. Halfway down the block, I glanced back at the hotel one last time. Through the massive windows, I could still see workers cleaning the ballroom. Everything looked exactly the same, as if I had never been there at all. Then a black sedan pulled away from the curb across the street. Its headlights briefly swept across the sidewalk. I barely noticed it. What I did not know was that someone inside that car was still watching. And for reasons I could not yet understand, my story was far from over. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a few seconds, I forgot what had happened. Then reality returned all at once. The hotel, the complaint, the termination paper folded inside my purse. I stared at the cracked ceiling above my bed and listened to the old radiator clicking in the corner of my apartment. Outside, New York was already awake. Car horns echoed from the street below. Someone shouted for a taxi. A delivery truck rattled past the building. Life kept moving. Mine felt stuck. I rolled out of bed and walked into the tiny kitchen. The coffee maker sputtered its final drops into a chipped mug I had owned since college. Across the counter sat a stack of envelopes. Rent, utilities, medical bills. I flipped one over without opening it. I already knew I could not pay it yet. My phone buzzed. "Mom." I answered immediately. "Good morning." Her voice sounded brighter than I felt. "Did you sleep?" "A little." "You sound tired." I forced a smile even though she could not see it. "Just a long shift." The lie came easier than I wanted to admit. She spent enough time worrying already. I refused to add another burden. We talked for 10 minutes about small things. The weather, her physical therapy appointment, a television show she liked. Neither of us mentioned money. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared out the window. Across town, in a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, Alexander Hayes was beginning his day very differently. Most people knew his name. Some called him a genius. Others called him ruthless. Financial magazines put his face on covers. Business channels analyzed his decisions. Entire companies changed direction when he entered a market. At 35, he had built Hayes Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. What most people did not know was that Alexander rarely paid attention to charity galas. He attended because appearances mattered, networking mattered, reputation mattered, but people interested him far less than numbers. Usually, that morning, however, a photograph sat on his desk. A simple image taken from security footage inside the Grand Regency Ballroom. It showed a waitress standing beside a table while wealthy guests laughed around her. Emily Parker. Alexander studied the image for several silent seconds. Then he pressed a button on his desk phone. "Nathan." His assistant answered immediately. "Yes, sir." "The waitress from last night." A brief pause followed. The one involved in the incident? Yes. What about her? Alexander looked at the photograph again. Find out who she is. May I ask why? Another pause. No, he ended the call. Across the city, I was sitting at my kitchen table calculating how many weeks of savings I had left. The answer was not encouraging. Around noon, I changed into a clean blouse and began searching job listings online. Restaurant server, receptionist, retail associate, anything. Every application felt like dropping a pebble into the ocean and hoping it reached shore. Hours passed. By late afternoon, my eyes hurt from staring at screens. That was when my phone rang again. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. Something told me to answer. Hello. The voice on the other end sounded professional. Calm. Precise. Is this Emily Parker? I sat up straighter. Yes. Miss Parker, my name is Nathan Reed. I am calling on behalf of Mr. Alexander Hayes. The name meant nothing to me. Yet somehow, hearing it made my heartbeat quicken. I think there has been a mistake, I said quietly. No, Miss Parker. His voice remained perfectly steady. There has not. For several seconds, I simply held the phone against my ear. The name still meant nothing to me, but the confidence in Nathan Reed's voice made it clear that whoever Alexander Hayes was, he was accustomed to people recognizing him immediately. I am sorry, I said carefully. I think you may have the wrong person. You are Emily Parker, 26 years old? He asked. Yes. Then I assure you, Miss Parker, I have the correct person. I glanced around my apartment as if answers might be hiding between the unpaid bills and faded kitchen cabinets. What exactly is this about? Mr. Hayes would like to meet with you. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded absurd. Why? A brief silence followed. I am not authorized to discuss that over the phone. Then I am not authorized to say yes. Another pause. This one felt different. Almost amused. Understood. If you change your mind, you may call me. He gave me a number and ended the conversation. I stared at my phone long after the call disconnected. Then I set it down and returned to my laptop. Job applications felt more urgent than mysterious billionaires. By 3 o'clock, my eyes were burning and my stomach reminded me I had skipped lunch. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The air carried that familiar Manhattan mixture of traffic, food carts, and concrete warming beneath spring sunlight. People rushed past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nobody noticed me. Nobody ever did. I stopped at a small deli and bought the cheapest sandwich on the menu. As I walked toward a nearby park bench, I noticed an elderly man standing near the crosswalk. He looked to be in his late 70s. Maybe older. Expensive coat. Polished shoes. Silver hair neatly combed back. Yet something seemed wrong. He swayed slightly. One hand gripped a street lamp. The other pressed against his chest. Most pedestrians walked around him without slowing down. Everyone appeared busy. Important. Late for something. I watched him for a few seconds. Then I saw his knees buckle. The sandwich nearly slipped from my hand as I rushed forward. Sir. I reached his side just as he stumbled. Are you okay? His face had gone pale. I am fine, he insisted, which immediately told me he was not. When was the last time you ate? He blinked. Excuse me. That answers my question. I guided him carefully toward a nearby bench. Sit down. Young lady, I do not take orders. Good. Because that was not a request. To my surprise, he laughed. A weak laugh, but still a laugh. He lowered himself onto the bench while I handed him my bottle of water. Drink. You always this bossy. Only with strangers trying to collapse on sidewalks. He took a few slow sips. Color gradually returned to his face. For the next 20 minutes, I sat beside him while he recovered. We talked about ordinary things. The weather, the Yankees, New York traffic. He never mentioned what he did for a living, and I never asked. Eventually, a black luxury sedan pulled up beside the curb. A driver stepped out immediately. The man's expression shifted from concern to relief the moment he saw the older gentleman. Sir, we have been looking everywhere for you. The elderly man smiled and stood carefully. Then he turned toward me. Thank you, Emily. I froze. How do you know my name? His eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. That is an excellent question. Before I could ask another, he stepped into the waiting car. As the sedan disappeared into traffic, I stood alone on the sidewalk with one strange realization. For the second time in 2 days, someone I had never met seemed to know exactly who I was. That night, I could not stop thinking about the old man. His face kept appearing in my mind every time I tried to focus on something else. The way he had smiled. The way he had somehow known my name. Most of all, the way his driver had reacted when he arrived. Not like an employee finding a lost client. More like someone responsible for protecting a very important person. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting beside my mother's hospital bed helping her finish a crossword puzzle. The television played quietly in the background. Neither of us paid much attention until the evening news switched to a business segment. A familiar face appeared on the screen. I nearly dropped the magazine in my hands. It was him, the old man from the park. "That is William Bennett," the anchor announced. The retired founder of Bennett Industries and longtime mentor to billionaire investor Alexander Hayes. I stared at the television. My mother noticed immediately. "Emily, that man." I pointed toward the screen. "I met him today." Mom laughed softly. "You met William Bennett?" "Apparently. Honey, he is practically a legend in New York business circles." I looked back at the television. The report continued. Photos flashed across the screen. Corporate events, charity functions, economic conferences. Then another face appeared. Tall, dark suit, calm blue eyes. The same man I had seen watching me from across the ballroom. Alexander Hayes. My pulse skipped. For the first time, the pieces connected. The mysterious phone call. The security footage. The old man. None of it felt random anymore. Across the city, inside the top floor of Hayes' Capital headquarters, Alexander sat alone in his office overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in silver and gold. Most employees had already gone home. He had not. A tablet rested on his desk, displaying a short report. Emily Parker, age 26. No criminal record. No debt outside ordinary medical expenses. Consistent employment history. Volunteer work at a local food pantry twice a month. Primary caregiver for her mother. Alexander read the file twice. Then he closed it. "Interesting," he murmured. A knock sounded at the door. Nathan entered carrying another folder. "Mr. Bennett called." Alexander looked up. "And?" Nathan smiled slightly. "He wanted to inform you that the young woman passed his test." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Test." His word, not mine. For the first time all day, a faint smile touched Alexander's face. William Bennett had spent decades teaching him how to evaluate character. Wealth could be inherited. Intelligence could be trained. Reputation could be manufactured. Character was different. Character revealed itself when nobody expected a reward. What exactly happened? Alexander asked. Nathan handed him a summary. Alexander read quietly. The woman had given up her lunch break. Stayed with a stranger. Refused money. Asked for nothing. Expected nothing. When he finished reading, he placed the paper down slowly. Most people treated powerful individuals differently once they recognized them. Emily had helped William without knowing who he was. That mattered, more than she realized. Back in the hospital room, I helped Mom adjust her blanket before preparing to leave. "You seem distracted," she said. I forced a smile. "Just tired." She studied me carefully. Mothers always seemed able to see through lies. "Whatever is happening," she said softly, "do not let fear make decisions for you." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "I am not sure yet." She squeezed my hand. "But I think something is changing." As I walked out of the hospital that evening, my phone vibrated again. A new text message had arrived from an unfamiliar number. It contained only one sentence. "Mr. Hayes would still very much like to meet with you." I stopped walking. People flowed around me on the sidewalk while the city lights reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. The message remained on my screen. Simple, polite, impossible to ignore. "Mr. Hayes would still very much like to meet with you." I should have deleted it. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Wealthy strangers did not suddenly appear in my life. Billionaires certainly did not. Yet as I stood there outside the hospital, I found myself remembering the ballroom, the laughter, the humiliation, and one man who had simply watched without joining in. By the time I reached my apartment, the message was still unanswered. I heated a can of soup for dinner and sat at the small kitchen table. The silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, I picked up my phone and typed 3 words. "Why me?" The response arrived less than a minute later. "Because Mr. Hayes believes you deserve an opportunity." I stared at the screen. Opportunity. The word sounded beautiful. Dangerous too. People often attach conditions to opportunities. Favors. Expectations. Invisible strings. I had spent most of my life learning not to depend on promises. The next morning, Another rejection email arrived. Then another. Then a third. Position filled. Candidate selected. We appreciate your interest. Every message felt identical. By noon, frustration settled into my chest like a stone. I closed my laptop and headed outside for air. Manhattan moved at its usual relentless pace. Construction crews shouted instructions. Delivery bikes wove through traffic. Street vendors called to passing customers. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going except me. My phone rang again. Nathan Reed. This time, I answered immediately. Ms. Parker, you are persistent. It is part of my job. Despite myself, I smiled slightly. What exactly does Mr. Hayes want? A conversation. People like him do not schedule conversations with people like me. Nathan was silent for a moment. Perhaps that is exactly why he wants to. I had no response to that. There is no obligation, he continued. One meeting. 30 minutes. If afterward you never wish to speak with him again, that decision will be respected. 30 minutes. That sounded harmless. Small. Manageable. Yet my pulse still quickened. And where would this meeting happen? At Hayes Capital headquarters. I nearly laughed. Of course it would. The most intimidating building in the city probably belonged to him. Nathan gave me a date and time. 2 days away. Think about it, he said. That is all we ask. After the call ended, I wandered through Midtown without paying attention to where I was going. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a bookstore. Through the window, people browsed quietly between shelves. Ordinary people. Ordinary lives. For a moment, I envied them. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. Emily, she said warmly when I answered. How is the job search? I hesitated. Complicated. Life usually is. I laughed softly. Mom, what if someone offered you an opportunity that made absolutely no sense? I would ask myself one question. What question? Her answer came instantly. Are you afraid because it is wrong, or because it might change your life? I stood frozen on the sidewalk after the call ended. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. And for the first time since losing my job, the future felt uncertain in a way that was not entirely frightening. 2 days later, I stood across the street from Hayes Capital and questioned every decision that had brought me there. The building rose above Manhattan like a monument to ambition. Glass, steel, power. People in tailored suits moved through the revolving doors with purpose, carrying coffee cups and conversations that probably involved numbers larger than I could imagine. Meanwhile, I stood on the sidewalk clutching a purse that had seen better years and wondering if I should turn around. My phone buzzed. A message from Nathan. We are expecting you. Somehow that made leaving feel impossible. I crossed the street. The lobby alone looked more expensive than my entire apartment building. Polished marble reflected sunlight from towering windows. Fresh flowers decorated the reception desk. Everything felt quiet, controlled, efficient. The receptionist smiled the moment I approached. Ms. Parker. I blinked. Yes. Mr. Reed is waiting for you. Of course he was. Everyone seemed to know who I was before I introduced myself. A private elevator carried me upward. My stomach tightened with every passing floor. Nathan greeted me when the doors opened. He looked exactly how I imagined a billionaire's assistant would look. Perfect suit. Perfect posture. Perfect calm. Thank you for coming, he said. I am still not sure why I am here. That makes 2 of us. I laughed despite myself. He smiled slightly. Mr. Hayes prefers drawing his own conclusions. He led me through a corridor lined with glass offices overlooking the city. Employees worked quietly behind computer screens. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed careless. The entire place felt like it operated according to rules I had never learned. Finally, Nathan stopped outside a large office. He is inside. My pulse immediately accelerated. Any advice? Nathan considered the question. Be exactly who you were in the park. Before I could ask what that meant, he opened the door. The office was surprisingly simple. No gold decorations. No oversized displays of wealth. Just clean lines, bookshelves, and windows revealing miles of Manhattan skyline. Alexander Hayes stood near the glass overlooking the city. He turned when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Up close, he looked exactly as I remembered. Tall, composed. The kind of confidence that did not need attention because it already expected respect. His blue eyes studied me quietly. Not cold, not warm, simply observant. Ms. Parker. His voice was calm. Thank you for coming. I almost did not. Something flickered in his expression. Amusement, perhaps. I know. He gestured toward a chair. I sat carefully. He remained standing for a moment before taking the seat across from me. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me for days. Why am I here? Alexander leaned back slightly. Because I became curious. I frowned. Curious about what? His gaze never left mine. You. That answer only confused me more. You do not even know me. That is true. He folded his hands. Which is why I wanted to change that. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Every scenario I had imagined ended differently. None of them included a billionaire admitting curiosity. Then Alexander said something that completely caught me off guard. Tell me, Emily, why did you help William Bennett when you thought he was just an elderly stranger? The question caught me completely off guard. Out of everything I expected Alexander Hayes to ask, that was not it. I stared at him for a moment, searching for some hidden meaning. Because he needed help, I finally said. Alexander remained silent. Waiting. That is it, he asked. What else would there be? He studied me carefully. Most people would have recognized him. I did not. Exactly. I folded my hands in my lap. Would it have mattered? For the first time since I entered his office, something changed in his expression. Not much. Just enough to notice. Most people would say yes. Then maybe most people are different from me. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite serious either. The silence that followed felt strangely comfortable. Outside the windows, Manhattan stretched toward the horizon. Thousands of people rushing through lives they barely had time to understand. Up here, everything seemed slower. More deliberate. William called me that afternoon, Alexander said. He does not usually call to discuss strangers. I'm not sure if I should be flattered or worried. Probably both. I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound surprised me. So did the fact that it seemed to surprise him as well. Alexander leaned back in his chair. Tell me about yourself. There is not much to tell. I doubt that. His attention never drifted. Most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. Alexander listened as though every answer mattered. Somehow that made me nervous. I told him about my mother. About the physical therapy appointments. About working events and restaurants while trying to keep up with bills. I left out the worst parts. The nights spent calculating expenses. The fear that arrived every time another medical statement appeared in the mail. But even the shortened version seemed to tell him enough. That sounds difficult, he said. Some days. And yet you continue. I shrugged. What is the alternative? Alexander nodded slowly. Most people spend their energy looking for excuses. I do not have time for excuses. That earned the closest thing to a genuine smile I had seen from him. No, he agreed quietly. I do not think you do. The conversation continued longer than I expected. We spoke about New York. Books. Family. Work. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow the hour passed without either of us noticing. Eventually, there was a knock at the door. Nathan stepped inside. Mr. Hayes, your board meeting begins in 15 minutes. Reality returned immediately. Billionaire schedules. Executive meetings. Worlds far removed from mine. I stood. I should go. Alexander rose as well. Thank you for coming. Thank you for answering almost none of my questions. A faint laugh escaped him. An actual laugh this time. Low and genuine. Fair criticism. I picked up my purse. So what happens now? His expression became thoughtful. That depends. On what? Whether you are interested in an opportunity. There was that word again. Opportunity. The same word Nathan had used. The same word that sounded both hopeful and dangerous. I crossed my arms. You still have not explained what kind of opportunity. Alexander walked toward his desk and picked up a folder. Then he handed it to me. I opened it and immediately froze. Inside was an offer letter. A real one. Printed on Hayes capital letterhead. My eyes moved across the page. Community Outreach Coordinator. Full benefits. Flexible schedule. Salary higher than anything I had ever earned in my life. I looked up at him in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Alexander's gaze remained steady. I am completely serious. For several seconds, I could not speak. The numbers on the page felt unreal. Not exaggerated. Unreal. The salary alone was more than I had earned in some entire years. Health insurance. Retirement benefits. Flexible hours. Paid leave. Every line looked like something designed for someone else's life. Not mine. I looked up from the folder. Why? Alexander did not answer immediately. Because I believe you would be good at it. You do not know that. I know enough. I shook my head. You cannot offer someone a position based on one conversation. Actually, I can. That is not what I meant. A faint smile touched his face again. I know. I lowered my eyes to the folder. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately. My mother's treatments flashed through my mind. The stack of unpaid bills. The constant anxiety that followed me everywhere. This job could change all of that. Yet another part of me felt uncomfortable. Opportunities this large usually came with expectations hidden beneath the surface. You are suspicious, Alexander observed. Should I not be? Probably. I laughed softly despite myself. Then I closed the folder and placed it back on his desk. The movement seemed to surprise him. No, he asked. Not yet. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You are refusing? I am being careful. The room fell quiet. Most people probably would have accepted before reaching the second page. I knew that. Alexander knew it too. Yet something inside me would not let me sign. Not until I understood why this was happening. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. More than you realize. But I need time. To my surprise, he nodded. Fair enough. You are not upset? Should I be? Most powerful people are not used to hearing no. That earned another genuine smile. Then perhaps it is good for me. The answer caught me off guard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Sunlight reflected against the windows behind him, painting the office in shades of gold. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Yet somehow the room felt smaller now. Less intimidating. More human. Take the folder, Alexander said. Review everything. I hesitated. There is no deadline. There is. When you are ready. I laughed again. That is not a real deadline. It is the only one that matters. When I finally left Hayes Capital, the afternoon air felt different. Not because the city had changed. Because I had. The folder rested inside my bag while questions raced through my mind. I spent the subway ride home reading every page twice. By the time I reached my apartment, I still had not made a decision. That evening, I visited my mother. She noticed something immediately. You look thoughtful. That is one word for it. I handed her the folder. She adjusted her reading glasses and slowly reviewed the offer. The longer she read, the wider her eyes became. Emily, I know. This is incredible. Or suspicious. She looked up over the top of the pages. Honey, those are not the same thing. I sat beside her hospital bed and stared out the window. What if I do not belong in that world? My mother closed the folder. The better question is whether that world deserves someone like you. I turned toward her. She smiled softly. Do not confuse unfamiliar with impossible. Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat awake long after midnight. The folder remained open on my kitchen table. I kept reading the first page over and over. Yet it was not the job offer occupying my thoughts anymore. It was the man who had made it. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether Alexander Hayes had been studying me as carefully as I had begun studying him. 3 days passed before I made my decision. 3 days of reading the offer. 3 days of questioning my instincts. 3 days of imagining every possible way the situation could go wrong. On the fourth morning, I called Nathan. I would like to accept the position. The silence lasted less than a second. Excellent. Somehow he sounded unsurprised. When do I start? Monday. That is 4 days away. Mr. Hayes prefers efficiency. I laughed softly. I am beginning to notice that. Monday arrived faster than expected. My first week at Hayes Capital felt like stepping into a completely different universe. The work was challenging, but not impossible. Community outreach projects, charity partnerships, scholarship initiatives, programs designed to help people who had been overlooked by everyone else. Ironically, I understood those people better than anyone in the office. The strange part was how seriously my opinions were taken. When I spoke during meetings, people listened. When I offered ideas, executives wrote them down. Nobody looked through me. Nobody dismissed me. For the first time in a very long time, I felt visible. 2 weeks later, an invitation appeared on my desk. Annual Hayes Foundation Gala. Formal attire required. I stared at the card for several seconds. My stomach immediately tightened. The last gala I attended had cost me my job. Nathan appeared beside my desk later that afternoon. You are going. It was not a question. I am considering hiding. Unfortunately, that is not an approved strategy. I sighed. Do I have to? Yes. You sound suspiciously happy about that. Nathan smiled. Perhaps. The evening of the event arrived with clear skies and cool spring air. The ballroom was located in one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels. Not the same one as before. Somehow that barely mattered. Crystal chandeliers still hung overhead. Expensive gowns still shimmered beneath golden light. Wealth still moved through the room like a language I was learning to understand. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress and reminded myself to breathe. Then I heard a familiar voice. Well, this is unexpected. Every muscle in my body froze. I turned slowly. Standing near a cocktail table was the woman in the silver gown. The same woman who had blamed me for her spilled drink weeks earlier. Beside her stood several guests from that night. Their expressions shifted from surprise to recognition. It is her, one of them said quietly. Another laughed. The waitress. The word landed harder than it should have. I felt the old embarrassment creeping back. The memory of laughter. The memory of standing alone while everyone watched. The woman folded her arms. Interesting career change. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Part of me wanted to defend myself. Another part remembered something my mother once said. Never explain your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. So I simply smiled politely. Good evening. That seemed to annoy her even more. You certainly move through social circles quickly. The group around her chuckled. Not as loudly as before, but enough. Around us, guests continued mingling. Music drifted through the ballroom. Conversations blended together beneath sparkling chandeliers. Yet suddenly I felt 26 years old and unemployed again. Small, out of place, forgotten. Then someone near the entrance stopped speaking. Another conversation faded. Then another. A ripple moved through the ballroom. I turned toward the doorway just as Alexander Hayes entered the room. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed instantly. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Even the people who had been mocking me moments earlier straightened their posture as Alexander crossed the room. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved. No entourage. No announcement. Yet attention followed him naturally. The same way sunlight draws eyes toward a window. I watched him greet several board members before continuing through the crowd. The woman in the silver gown immediately smiled. A different smile than the one she had aimed at me. Polished. Careful. Calculated. Alexander, she called warmly. He acknowledged her with a polite nod, but did not stop. The smile on her face faltered. My pulse quickened as he continued walking toward me. Every step seemed to stretch time. I suddenly became aware of everything. The music, the crystal glasses, the weight of dozens of eyes watching the interaction unfold. Alexander stopped beside me. Emily. His voice was calm as always. You made it. I stared at him for half a second. You invited me. And yet I was not entirely certain you would come. A few people nearby exchanged confused glances. The woman in the silver gown looked from him to me and back again. You know each other? She asked. Alexander turned toward her. Of course. The simple answer landed harder than any insult ever could. Confusion spread across several faces. One man actually blinked twice as if trying to process what he had heard. Alexander looked back at me. How has your evening been? It was an innocent question. Yet somehow he seemed to notice everything hidden beneath it. The uncomfortable introductions. The subtle comments. The memories of another ballroom and another night. Eventful, I replied. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger. With understanding. I see. The woman laughed lightly. We were just catching up with Emily. Small world, apparently. Alexander regarded her quietly for a moment. Long enough for the confidence in her voice to begin fading. Then he said something that made the entire table fall silent. Emily is one of the most valuable people at Hayes Foundation. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Alexander continued calmly. Several of our newest outreach initiatives exist because of her recommendations. I felt my face warm. He had never said that to me directly. Around us, expressions shifted. Surprise. Uncertainty. Embarrassment. Suddenly, I was no longer the former waitress they remembered. I was someone Alexander Hayes openly respected. And in their world, that distinction mattered. A great deal. The woman forced another smile. How wonderful. It is, Alexander replied. His tone remained perfectly polite, which somehow made it more powerful. He turned toward me again. There is someone I would like you to meet. Who? The chairman of the foundation board. My eyes widened. Tonight. Tonight. Before I could protest, he offered his arm. Not as a command. Not as a performance. Simply as an invitation. For one brief second, the ballroom seemed completely silent. Every person who had laughed at me weeks earlier was watching. waiting, wondering. I remembered standing alone in a server uniform while people dismissed me without learning my name. Now those same people watched as Alexander Hayes chose to walk across the ballroom with me beside him. And for the first time, I realized the room had already decided which of us truly belonged there. My heart was still racing as Alexander guided me through the ballroom. Conversations followed us like waves. Everywhere we walked, people smiled, nodded, introduced themselves. Yet I could not stop thinking about the group standing behind us. The same people who had once dismissed me without hesitation. It was amazing how quickly respect appeared when someone influential decided you mattered. Alexander seemed completely unaware of the attention, or perhaps he was simply accustomed to it. We stopped near a large round table where several distinguished guests were seated. One of them immediately stood. Alexander. Richard. They shook hands. Alexander turned toward me. I would like you to meet Richard Lawson, chairman of the Hayes Foundation Board. The older man smiled warmly. So you are Emily. I laughed softly. People keep saying that like I am supposed to know why. Richard chuckled. Trust me, we have heard plenty about you. My eyes immediately moved toward Alexander. He remained perfectly calm. I hope only good things. Richard smiled. The best things. For the next 20 minutes, I found myself discussing community programs, scholarship initiatives, and neighborhood outreach projects. Topics I genuinely cared about. To my surprise, the board members listened carefully. They asked questions, took notes, requested my opinions. Nobody interrupted. Nobody spoke down to me. At one point, Richard leaned back in his chair and nodded thoughtfully. You know, that is an excellent idea. The simple comment meant more than he realized. Months ago, people barely remembered my name. Tonight, one of the most influential charitable organizations in New York was treating my ideas with genuine respect. Eventually, Richard stood and tapped a spoon lightly against his glass. The ballroom gradually quieted. Guests turned toward the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Before we conclude tonight's program, there is one person I would like to recognize. I immediately assumed he meant a major donor. Someone important. Someone wealthy. Then Richard smiled in my direction. My stomach dropped. Over the past several months, our foundation has expanded programs serving families, students, and underserved communities throughout New York. Much of that progress is the result of one remarkable individual. The room became silent. Completely silent. Emily Parker. I froze. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. Her dedication, insight, and compassion have helped shape projects that are already changing lives. Applause began spreading through the ballroom. At first polite, then stronger, louder, more sincere. I stood motionless, unable to process what was happening. The people who had laughed at me weeks earlier were clapping now. The same hands, the same faces. Yet everything had changed. Or perhaps nothing had. Perhaps the difference was simply that someone had finally taken the time to see who I really was. Richard continued speaking, but his words blurred beneath the sound of applause. My eyes found Alexander across the room. He was watching quietly, not seeking attention, not taking credit, just watching. The way he had watched me on that first terrible night. The applause finally faded. Guests returned to their conversations. Yet something inside me felt different. Lighter, stronger. For the first time in a very long time, I was not wondering whether I belonged. And when I looked across the ballroom again, I noticed something else. Alexander Hayes had not taken his eyes off me once. The gala ended slowly, like the final notes of a song lingering in the air after the music stops. Guests drifted toward the exits carrying conversations and business cards. Staff members cleared tables. The chandeliers still glowed overhead, but the energy had softened. I stood near one of the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, watching thousands of city lights stretch into the distance. For the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. You look different. Alexander's voice came from beside me. I turned and smiled. Different good or different concerning? Good. He slipped his hands into his pockets and looked out at the skyline. Definitely good. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The kind of silence that does not demand filling. Then he surprised me again. Do you remember the first time I saw you? I laughed softly. You mean the night my life fell apart? That depends on how you define falling apart. I shook my head. I was humiliated. I lost my job. True. His gaze remained on the city beyond the glass. But I also saw something that night. What? He turned toward me. Everyone else saw a waitress. My heart slowed. And you? For a brief second, the powerful businessman disappeared. The billionaire. The public figure. The man whose decisions moved markets. What remained was simply Alexander. Honest. Unguarded. I saw someone who refused to become bitter. The words settled quietly between us. That is a strange thing to notice. Not really. He smiled. Most people spend their lives letting difficult moments define them. His eyes held mine. You never did. I looked away first. Not because I wanted to. Because suddenly emotions I had been avoiding for months became impossible to ignore. You gave me a chance, I said quietly. No, his answer came immediately. You earned one. The distinction mattered. More than he probably realized. We stood there for another moment while the city sparkled below. Then Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. What is that? I asked. Something William told me years ago. He handed it to me. The paper was worn from age. Carefully preserved. A single sentence had been written across the center. Character is what remains when applause disappears. I read it twice before looking up. That sounds like him. Alexander laughed softly. It does. Then his expression grew thoughtful. The funny thing is that I spent years surrounding myself with successful people. And then I met someone remarkable. Heat rose to my face immediately. Alexander. I am serious. His voice remained calm. Steady. Certain. The people in that ballroom noticed your position. I noticed your character. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city lights reflected in the glass behind him. The same city that once made me feel invisible. The same city where strangers laughed without knowing my name. Yet somehow, standing there beside him, those memories no longer hurt. Because I finally understood something. The people who mocked me had never actually known me. Their opinions had been built on assumptions. Appearances. Labels. But the people who mattered had looked deeper. Alexander smiled. Ready to go? I smiled back. Yes. Together, we walked toward the exit. And as the doors closed behind us, I realized something beautiful. Sometimes the people who overlook your worth are not the authors of your story. They are simply a footnote. The real story begins the moment someone sees who you truly are. And more importantly, the moment you do too.